President of the Laguna Beach Historical Society. Yes, indeed. Thanks very much. Hey, by the way, just to let you know, in the back of the room we have folks from, who is it, David Mitchell, LagunaWorldNews.com. And so if you were not here, or if you're virtually at home at your computer, you can watch this live on the internet. So there you go. What we have a little tiny bit of business to take care of because the board of directors of your Laguna Beach Historical Society is elected by the membership, and we'd like to have that election take place. We don't expect this to be a contested election. What I'd like to do is to have the board be elected by acclamation. I'd like to recognize the board members and have them stand. Then we would like to open the floor to nominations. Basically, that's the invitation to... Dave, you can't see anything from over there. Okay, move over this way. Okay, so... yeah, just a good idea. Tip of the trade. If you would like to join the Historical Society Board of Directors, we meet every other month from 7 o'clock in the evening, the second Tuesday of the month, for about an hour and a half. We conduct other business via email, so it's 6 meetings a year. When it gets to that, if you'd like to join us, just nominate yourself, and I think it would be highly unlikely for you to lose. So I'm on the board. Kimberly Stewart is our vice president. I haven't seen Kimberly. Nelda Stone is our secretary. Stand up, Nelda. Anne Frank is former president. Willa Gupta. John Hoover, his mother. There's John Hoover in the rear. Jane Jantz, our archivist. Eric Jessen in the front row. Ed Perry, is Ed Perry here? Ed doesn't have an email, so we have to call him every once in a while. Hope, Kevin Spencer, Kevin's here, back there in South 40. Vern Spitaleri in the front row. Georgina Valdez, she's here. Where's Georgina? Oh, at the door. And Victoria Winters. And so their names are placed in nomination. Would anyone, we open the nominations to the floor, would anyone like to join this august group? Okay, all right.
I move the nominations be closed.
All right, very good. Okay, we ready to elect the board by acclamation? Okay, let's vote. All for? Aye. All against? Very good, thank you very much. Just so everybody knows, we have a number of programs that we put on during the year. Sometimes it's only one, sometimes it's been as many as 3. The board's primarily responsibility is the Murphy Smith Bungalow at 278 Ocean Avenue, right next door to the Wells Fargo Bank. The Wells Fargo Bank owns the bungalow and leases it to us for $1 a year, so that's pretty swell, and we certainly thank them. Most of the past years, the City of Laguna Beach has given us a grant of $1,000 a year. We certainly appreciate that. Our membership is just $15 a year. The board, of course, is purely volunteer and unpaid. So if you're not a member of the Laguna Beach Historical Society, we would encourage you to do so. We now have business members who we ask for a $50 donation, and there's a number of them that have joined. If you received the newsletter in the mail, we don't need your address, obviously it works, but we are collecting email addresses. So if you haven't signed, Georgina, could you pass around the clipboards? If the clipboard gets to you and you're willing to give us your address, once again, you don't need to give it to us, we already successfully mailed you the newsletter, but put down your name, and if you have an email address, we would appreciate that. So in the past, we've had programs on the 25th anniversary of the 1978 Bluebird Canyon Slide, the history of saving Laguna Canyon, the 10-year anniversary of the 1993 Laguna wildfire, Villa Rockledge, and that was Roger Jones. Roger Jones is here. He put on a wonderful program on Villa Rockledge. And then last May, we had the history of the Laguna Art Museum. Okay, everybody get your pens and pencils out. The next program is already scheduled for Monday, September the 18th, right here. And it's going to be by Larry Lytle on a photographer, William Mortensen. And let's see, did we get elected? Okay, that's great. Can everybody see the screen? The nice thing, particularly if anybody has a topic, an interest in putting on a program, we are happy to do the work and scan the information in and put the PowerPoint together. And there's no rush. We're the Historical Society, you know. So if it's later on this year, if it's in 2008, if it's 2010, you know, we can build it up. There's, you know, time flies, right? So seriously, if you have a topic, we would like to do it. The board is very concerned that every day part of Laguna's history is being lost. And so if there are any artifacts or if there are photographs, historical photographs, we really would like them to be donated to the Laguna Beach Historical Society than thrown away. And actually, we would love to preserve them, even if you don't want to give them to us. If you loan them to us, we'll scan them in digitally, at least the record will be preserved, and then we'll immediately give them back to you. Okay, well, might as well start the program, huh? So what we have here is some fantastic, you know, we all know some Laguna Beach characters, and we're going to be talking about a couple of them here tonight. As part of Laguna Beach's Heritage Month, we are holding this program. Dr. Lou Delia is the owner of the Pancho Barnes estate, and he's going to relate the history of George Hurell and Pancho Barnes in Laguna Beach. And I'm sure he'll tell us more, but my understanding is for many, many years as a young man, Lou has been collecting photographs of George Hurell, and he tried to purchase some from the Pancho Barnes estate, found out that she had kept everything together, and it was at risk of being sold off piecemeal. And so he figured out a way to keep it intact. I would like to mention that at the Laguna Art Museum, in the stairwell going down, there's an early days of Laguna Beach exhibition that's currently there. And it's got a lot of interesting stuff, including 5 photographs by George Hurell. So the Laguna Beach Impressionists, if you go there and you see the photo of Edgar Payne, Anna Hills, William Griffith, William Wendt, Frank Kuprian, they are all George Hurell photographs. So, wait a second, let's see. Are any of the board members willing to give up their seats and come up here and sit, so there'll be a few more seats down there? I certainly would appreciate it. And without any further ado, let me turn this over to Lou Delia.
Thank you, Gene, for that introduction, and I want to thank the Laguna Beach Historical Society for the invitation of this evening hosting this. And I want to acknowledge Gene Felder, especially for helping launch me into the 21st century by helping me put this PowerPoint presentation that we're going to see tonight. Otherwise, we'd be passing photographs around. And also would like to thank his wife, Johanna, for loaning me her husband for those several hours 3 weeks ago. Also, it's important to acknowledge as we start here the estate and family of George Hurell, who've been very helpful in providing a lot of the materials we're going to see tonight, especially George Jr. and his wife Jeanette, Michael and Marcy Hurell, and Frank and Daphne Hurell Cortese, my partner Mike Salazar, Maxine Dugan, who's here, and Eric Jensen for all their help. So now on with the show. We're going to talk tonight about 2 major characters that lived here by the name of George Hurell and Florence Leontine Lowe Barnes, later known as Pancho Barnes. Let's see. And make this go forward.
Look to the left, left, hit the left. No, I think they're about
Here?
left side.
I did. It's not working. So much for the 21st century.
Oh, no, wait. This is left.
Wait a minute. Maybe it goes to sleep here. No? Okay. Well, we all know the natural beauty of Laguna Beach has inspired countless artists through the years, and Laguna Beach has well earned its place in history as an artist colony. However, I suspect that most people who live here don't realize that one of the most influential photographers of the 20th century started his career right here in Laguna Beach, and his name was George Hurell. Gene, it's not advancing.
We have the non-technical approach.
Okay. And it was working a moment ago. All right, good. Here we see a photograph of George Edward Hurell, who was born in 1904, and he's credited with developing the glamour idiom in photography and creating the standard for the idealized Hollywood glamour portrait. He invented the boom light and is credited with developing other innovative lighting techniques. And today, many of the Hollywood photographers working often refer to their own work as shooting in the Hurell style. Now, the photographs I'm going to show you this evening by George Hurell are a record of this man's tremendous creativity and imagination. A little bit about him. He is a first generation. His family came from England to Cincinnati, Ohio, where George was born. And his family were shoe manufacturers. And it was a very devout Catholic family. He had a sister and 3 brothers. His sister actually entered the nunnery, but dropped out about 2 months before taking her vows and married. And he had a brother also that entered the priesthood almost, and stopped about a month or so before he was to become a priest. And even George Hurell actually signed up at the Quigley Seminary in Chicago to become a priest, but decided to go to art school instead. And the reason I'm telling you that is because I think it's important to know sort of what influenced the person in their approach to life and sort of how they saw things. And my feeling, and I hope you'll agree by the end of this evening, is George Hurell always saw the beauty in things and the potential in a person and in a situation. And I think that was greatly influenced by his upbringing. Anyway, at age 19, George Hurell started out as a fine art painter, studying at the prestigious Art Institute in Chicago. And attracted to all things new and impressed with innovation, Hurell was greatly influenced by the paintings of an early Italian surrealist painter, Giorgio de Chirico. And so he began painting in that style. However, Hurell also enjoyed painting the occasional standard landscape. And next slide. And here we see George Hurell, actually he's retouching negatives. To earn extra money while attending school, he worked part-time for renowned portrait photographer Eugene Hutchinson in Chicago, retouching his negatives. Hurell's fine eye-hand coordination and artistic drawing skills were well suited for this task. Then, one spring day in 1925, while still attending the Art Institute, he heard that famed landscape painter Edgar Allan Payne, an alum of the Institute, would be giving a lecture at the school. Payne was passing through town on his way back to his wife and family here in Laguna Beach after having given lectures around the country, and he had become especially famous after having spent a couple of years painting in Europe a few years before that. So Hurell attended the lecture, and afterward Payne viewed the students' work, and Payne was particularly impressed with Hurell's experimental painting style and also liked a recently completed landscape painting. And Payne told him, "George, if you plan to be serious artist, you really should come back with me to Laguna Beach, because that's really where it's all happening." And since Hurell wanted to be a fine artist, he eagerly accepted the opportunity. And so Payne and Hurell set out for Laguna Beach by car, arriving in Laguna Beach just in time for Hurell to celebrate his 21st birthday on June 1st, 1925. Next slide. Now, a lot of these photos I'm going to show you tonight. Here we see Hurell in his car. George Hurell, just 21 years old. Next slide. Now, Mr. Payne arranged, by the way, this is on Thalia Street. This was, I'll tell you about in a minute. Mr. Payne arranged for Hurell to stay at a hillside beach cottage on Thalia Street, owned by Mel St. Clair, who was no longer living there because he was busy directing silent movies up in Hollywood. And in return to taking care of this property that he owned and making sure that it stayed safe and secure while the owner was away, Hurell got free rent and all the time he needed to paint. And so we see him, this is the hillside cottage that was owned by Mel St. Clair. Let's turn the next slide. Now, Hurell had brought with him from Chicago a secondhand view camera that he could photograph the various potential scenes during the warm spring and summer months as he had done in Chicago. Because of course, in the winter in Chicago, you cannot go outside and paint. So this was very typical. Most art students that were painting would go out and take photographs of things that they would then use as a reference to paint during the winter time. But of course, being here in Laguna Beach, it never snowed. And so he rarely used the camera, at least initially, although he did start to use the camera inside this little beach cottage, setting up little vignettes on the dresser and photographing them. But anyway, Hurell quickly settled into the Western lifestyle, enjoying the Mediterranean climate here, and spending his time going to the beach, fishing, and of course, painting. And here we see Hurell on the porch, in one of his paintings in the background. And Jean, there's that poster on the right. Did you want to, that's the, was it the?
But that's not the pageant of the Masters, but that's the one that Isaac Frazee started in 1921, which was raising money for the Art Association, the Art Gallery building.
So there he is, sitting there on the porch, looking at his gun. And next slide. Well, perhaps he's spending a little. George, I think you're spending a little too much time looking at the gun. Next slide. But he can do whatever he wants, I guess. So let's go to the next slide. So of course, Hurell being here was exposed to Hollywood, and those of you who knew or are familiar with Mel St. Clair, I'm not sure if this is Mel St. Clair. Actually, in the front, that's George in the camera. Let's see the next slide. We get a better view of him. And this is one of the things I was hoping to find out tonight, if that was Mel St. Clair in the front. But it's definitely George Hurell in the back. And next slide, please. But Hurell always managed to find time to go to the beach. And this was taken in about November of 1925, and he was getting letters from home saying there's 7 feet of snow on the ground. And George does not look too guilty here, but he's at the beach. And I think this is, it may be at the end of Thalia Street. Okay, so for Christmas dinner in 1925, Hurell was the guest of the Payne family at the home of William A. Griffith, another prominent Laguna Beach painter. And Payne was founder of the Laguna Beach Art Association, and William A. Griffith was president of the association at that time. And it was now time to introduce Hurell to all the major artists in the community. However, the most important person he met that evening was not a famous or influential painter, but a character. And I'm underlining the word character. 3 years his senior by the name of Florence Leontine Lowe Barnes. Next slide. And here she is in a photograph by George Hurell. Florence was a large, good-hearted woman with a big smile and a hearty laugh. And she was extremely intelligent and could hold her own in any conversation with the guys, and shared Hurell's passion for fishing. She was also a treasure trove for off-color jokes and witty observations. She was all this, and the wife of the most prominent Pasadena Episcopal minister. So naturally, the two became fast friends. Now, Florence had money. She had big money, having been born into one of the wealthiest families in America. In addition to her estate in Pasadena, which, Jean, next slide, which was located at 1350 South Garfield, a 32-room mansion there. Florence also owned a large estate on 40 acres along the cliffs here at what is now Smith's Cliffs and part of Emerald Bay. She owned it. Next slide. Her beloved home there was called Dos Rocas, and here we see a view. And now let's get the next slide. And here we see it again. Very large home. Somebody once asked her, Florence, what's it like to have, a 32-room mansion in Pasadena and a huge estate in Laguna Beach? And she just looked at the guy and said, well, nothing exceeds like excess. All right, next slide. So at this estate, of course, she had to do something, and so she installed there the first freshwater swimming pool in Laguna Beach overlooking the ocean. And here we see Florence poolside. And George Hurell was a frequent poolside guest at her home in Laguna Beach, and they also found time to sneak off and get some fishing in. Both George and Florence loved to fish. And whenever they went fishing, they always had a bet going who would catch the biggest fish of the day. And Florence always set the bet. She'd say, whoever loses has got to cook the fish. And Florence was quite competitive, and she actually hated to cook. And so poor George, his cooking skills and barbecuing skills greatly improved and actually became legendary in this community. Now, Florence loved to host parties at her home in Laguna Beach, and party she did. She had her friends over from Hollywood, and Ramon Navarro was among them. And at the time, Ramon Navarro was the most famous and the highest paid star in Hollywood. And Ramon was her best friend, and Florence, and vice versa. Next slide. And here we see another view of Florence Lowe's pool, and some friends and neighbors there. Next slide. And a closer view of the house and pool there in the foreground. Next slide, please. And we actually see Ramon Navarro here at her pool. Next slide, please. And a view off the back porch at Florence's house. Beautiful view. I wonder who has lot 19 now. Next slide. And of course, the party even in the gazebo on the property. And by the way, Eric Jessen recently took me on the little path, the public path out there. And that gazebo you can still see. It's still there. I'm sure it's been rebuilt many times, but the location is still there. Next slide, please. And there's Florence on the rocks below her house. Maybe even she was a little bit put off sometimes by all the party making. And next slide. And the partying on the beach below her house. And here's Pancho Barnes here. This is Ramon Navarro. This is Richard Halliburton. And someone told me that Paul Mooney, his partner's in here, but I don't know. But anyway, the partying continued and continued. Non-stop. She liked to party. Now, that's all well and good when you own 40 acres along the cliff, right? But about 400 feet south was her maternal grandmother, Carolyn Dobbins. She had a house there. Next slide. Now, she dearly loved her grandmother. And this is the house. The parties got so frequent and loud that her grandmother requested that she either cut back on the merrymaking or pay to have the house move further south on the property. Let's see the next slide. This is Grandmother Dobbins. This is probably a snitch. I don't know who this is. But anyway, Pancho dearly loved her grandmother, and respectful of what she had to say, thought it over, and wrote a check, and moved her grandmother's house. By 1927, Florence's mother had passed away, and her marriage to the Pasadena Episcopal minister was just not working out, so she decided to take a trip alone to see the lost city of Machu Picchu in Peru, and have time to herself so that she could just think some things through. Unfortunately, the ship that she boarded in San Pedro turned out to be a gun runner for Mexican revolutionaries. And although she was initially quite excited about the prospect of some new adventure, she decided that maybe she'd better jump ship in San Blas, which she did in Mexico. And then she spent the next 7 months roaming through Mexico. And when she returned to Pasadena, she had a new nickname. Next slide. She was now Pancho Barnes. And by the way, this is a name that she kept through 3 more marriages. Yeah, only in America could someone that was born Florence Leontine Lowe end up as Pancho Barnes. But she did. In 1928, Pancho decided that she wanted to learn how to fly an airplane, so she had heard that Orville Wright, of the famous Wright brothers, was the person who reviewed and signed all application requests. But Orville had a reputation for not really wanting women to get their license. He was really worried that a woman would crash the plane and then it would cast a pall over this new industry, aviation industry. And he had also really didn't like women driving. So Pancho didn't like the prospect of rejection merely based on her gender, and so she just decided to play a fast one on Orville Wright. Now, Florence Barnes was a gender indeterminate name. There was Florence Ziegfeld, and indeed the application never inquired as to gender, but it did request a photograph, which you had to submit with your application, and then later it would be attached to your license if he signed your ticket, after, of course, you'd taken your lessons. So Pancho remembered that her artist friend and painter George Hurell owned a camera. Indeed, she had seen some of the photos that he had started to take of some of the local artists in the community and actually thought that his photography was a lot better than his painting, and indeed thought that that's where his destiny probably was going to lie. And so she asked him to take her picture for her pilot's license. And for this application photo, she dressed up like a man, just to fool Orville, smoking a cigarette with dirty fingernails and all. Next photo. And here is the Hurell photograph he took for her pilot license application. Now, Hurell felt bad making his good friend Pancho look so awful for the pilot's application, and so he insisted on taking some nice photos of her. And he took several photos of her at home in Laguna Beach, posed against the back of her favorite chair. And he actually made her look beautiful. And she was not your classic beauty at all. And so naturally she loved them. And here's that photograph. Again by George Hurell. Not so bad. And she loved this, and loved it so much she actually inscribed a copy to her friend Ramon Navarro, who also liked it. And so Pancho started taking her flying lessons now that she had her application all together. Next slide. And of course, she had to put a tower with a windsock next to her house. Next slide. And she installed Laguna Beach's first private landing strip, which was just north of her house. Next. And Ramon Navarro, of course, was along for the ride and attended her first few lessons. Next slide. That's Ramon Navarro on the left. And again, Ramon Navarro and Pancho Barnes. Probably photographs by George Hurell. Next photo. And within 6 hours, she had soloed. And so Orville Wright signed the application. She was now officially a pilot, and off she went. Next slide. And here is Pancho Barnes's license, signed by Orville Wright on the left, as you see. July 30th, 1929, Orville Wright. And look at, there's that photograph by George Hurell. So Pancho later went on to be the first female stunt pilot in Hollywood and set numerous speed records in her travel air mystery ship airplane that was modified by her other really good friend, Howard Hughes. And many historians have commented that she was one of the most skilled pilots of the golden age of flight. Later, she reinvented herself in the 1940s and 50s as the owner of the famous, some would say infamous, Happy Bottom Riding Club, which was actually a dude ranch with a restaurant, hotel, and landing strip now on the site of Edwards Air Force Base. Most of you might remember, if you saw the movie The Right Stuff or read the book The Right Stuff, she was the owner of the restaurant where all the guys hung out. And she was always encouraged, Chuck Yeager and the rest of them, that he was going to break the sound barrier. Anyway, Pancho Barnes is a whole nother lecture. Next. All right, here we see Pancho getting a hug from Ramon Navarro, and this photograph is by Hurell, congratulating her on her soloing. And next. And here we see the official photograph as Pancho Barnes as pilot, taken by George Hurell. But now, you know what this means. Now that she has her license and an airstrip next to her home, now all her new pilot buddies can fly into party in Laguna Beach. Poor Grandma Dobbins now had an airport next door to her house. And let's see the next. And here are some of them. And this is Laguna Beach. And now Hurell joined in, but also liked to get away by himself to the beach at Laguna. And let's see that next picture. And here is Here's George, and this is probably near Thalia Street. And we see him on the beach. And he continued to photograph his friend Pancho Barnes and others in the community. Next slide, please. And here's another study of Pancho Barnes by George Hurell. Now that Pancho had her pilot license, she would often take her friend, George Hurell, with her on her flying expeditions into Mexico fishing. She loved to fish and actually loved Mexico and the Mexican culture immensely, and would often go down there fishing and drag George along. Let's see the next photograph. And so we have two photographs in the archive of George Hurell. This is George here, taken by Pancho Barnes. Okay, next one. Here's another one of George Hurell. Now at the time, Pancho's best friend, as I noted earlier, was Ramon Navarro, who was the biggest silent movie star at MGM. And he was actually the most famous movie star in the world, having come off of Ben-Hur, a movie. Now, Ramon Navarro was Mexican, and he had a slight accent. And he was in contract negotiations with MGM at the advent of sound pictures, and he was really concerned that he was maybe he wouldn't make the transition to sound pictures, but he had a beautiful operatic voice. He was a classically trained singer, and decided, well, if this doesn't work out, I'll reinvent myself as an opera star in Europe. And he's talking to Pancho Barnes, and he says, well, if he's going to do that, he better get some publicity photos online just in case the contract negotiations don't go well. But he really couldn't use any photographer in town, because if word leaked back to L.B. Mayer that he was concerned, it would seriously impact the negotiations. And so Pancho said, why not use George Hurell? And so he did. Next photograph. And so at Pancho's urging, Navarro had a series of photographs taken by George Hurell. And here we see Ramon Navarro dressed as a fisherman. Next. Another study of Ramon Navarro. Another study. One more. Here we go. And again, this is in one of his opera roles. All right. And then here's this next photograph here. And we see Ramon Navarro. This was actually taken at Pancho Barnes' estate in Pasadena with her favorite horse, Lightning. And when Pancho saw this photograph, she said, my God, if George Hurell can make my horse look as beautiful as the most handsome man in America, then everyone should be using George Hurell as their photographer. She was obviously very horse-centric. All right, now next slide. And here's another study of Ramon Navarro. This is actually a fairly famous photograph that George Hurell took. And in 1980, a 6x9 copy of this image was sold at auction and established George Hurell as the highest paid price at auction by a living photographer. And this print actually now is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Now, Navarro showed these photographs that I just showed you to his best friend back at the studio, Norma Shearer. And Norma Shearer, of course, loved this one. In particular, she says, my God, Ramon, you look great. And she says, I've got a problem. She says, Norma Shearer at the time was married to Irving Thalberg, who actually ran the studio. And she was sort of the Debbie Reynolds of her day during the silent film period. And she often played in these very sort of ingenue roles. And a script had come across her desk by the title Divorcee, and it required her to play this really sort of sexy vixen role. And so she went to her husband, Irving, and she says, Irving, I'd really like to play this role. He goes, honey, you could probably do it, but you're just not sexy in that way. Ooh, that really stinged her. And so she's back talking to Ramon, and Ramon says, why don't you go to George Hurell? And so George Hurell's second client is the wife of the studio head, basically, goes to her, she goes to him, and he takes these series of beautiful photographs. She looks absolutely beautiful. And let's see the next slide. This is one of them. Well, She throws them on her husband's desk and says, "What do you think now?" Well, first of all, their marriage improved. She got the role, played the part well, won the Academy Award for the role in that film, and a couple of weeks later, George Hurell was offered the job as portrait photographer at MGM. Now, at first he played hard to get because he was starting to get other film actresses and actors going to him. And he told Pancho, "Nah, I don't think I want to do it." She says, "You idiot, the Depression just is on. Everyone's lost their money, they're jumping out of buildings. Take this darn, I'm going to fly you up there right now." So flies George Hurell up to his interview with L.B. Mayer, takes the job, and on his way back he wing walks on her plane to celebrate. Let's take the next. And so we see George here going off to MGM. Next. And here's George Hurell's official MGM portrait as portrait photographer. All right, next slide, please. Now, here we see a portrait of Harriet Lake, later to be known as Ann Sothern. According to George Hurell, when young players were being considered at MGM, they were first sent to the studio portrait gallery for a series of photographic portraits, which served as their initial screen test. Hurell would make beautiful 11 by 14 and 10 by 13 prints that were sent directly to L.B. Mayer. And if he liked what he saw in the photos, then those photos were then shipped out to the various fan magazines, of which there were many in the 1920s and 30s. And depending on the fan mail response from those magazines, decided whether or not that actor or actress would actually get a screen test. So there was a lot, so photography was extremely important to the development of someone's film career. And Hurell's training as a painter and his enhanced understanding of lighting, exposure, and composition and contrast all helped to make his photographs stand out. Hurell brought an undeniable style and sophistication to each setting, whether it was with an established star or a young contract player on the road to fame or obscurity for that matter. So here we see, as I said, someone who would be later known as Ann Sothern, and this was actually one of the first people he shot, and even his props had not arrived, and so he just improvised with what he had there, and he still had a fairly interesting photograph happen. Loretta Young once commented, "We thought we were gorgeous because by the time Hurell finished with you, you were gorgeous." So still photography was instrumental to the development of the stars from the beginning, long before anyone had heard their usually made-up names. Let's go to the next slide. And here we see Dorothy Jordan on the set with George Hurell, and on your right here, you'll notice George's large format camera that contained here an 8 by 10 film. And Dorothy Jordan was actually a very famous silent film star, played opposite Ramon Navarro in a lot of his big films. She did not make the transition well to talkies, but married quite well. She married Miriam C. Cooper. Miriam C. Cooper is one of the biggest producers of the day. Steven Spielberg is the Miriam C. Cooper of our time. He produced things like King Kong and some major movies. Okay, next one. And of course, George Hurell, being at MGM, took some time when he had it and visited the sets. And as I said, sound had just come in. This is the sound boom. And he had, in taking photographs of people, he realized that it was hard to get a shine on a person's head. He liked the hair to really shine. And looking at this, he said, "Gee, why don't I put a light on a pole?" Next slide. And so he invented the boom light, which is standard in photography. And that was an invention of George Hurell. And next slide. And you can see the boom light being used here. And here's George. There's the boom light. Next one, please. And you can see it being used here to good effect on Norma Shear. Next slide. And here we have a view of the MGM photography lab. And it's important to keep in mind when you're looking at the photos I'm going to be showing you of some of these great old classic movie stars from the 30s, that they were taken during the Great Depression years. And America was badly in need of idols, and cinema rushed to supply them. And these photos helped the movie makers give the American people hope through identification with the heroes on the screen. And Hurell was busy inventing a whole new race of human beings who were immune to age, acne, and overweight. The photograph that he created was not meant to reveal the truth. The goal was really to create a kind of icon for public worship. And on an 8x10 sheet of photographic film, Hurell sculpted faces that launched a million fantasies. Next slide. Everyone know who this is? That's right, it's Jimmy Durante. And this is actually Jimmy Durante's first official portrait at MGM. He had come out by train from New York. He was a big, big vaudeville star, and had an appointment with L.B. Mayer to pursue a bigger film career in Hollywood, although he had made some films before, but MGM was really where he wanted to be. And so he arrived in Pasadena. They brought him by car to the lot down in Culver City, and he was right on time, the professional that he is, but L.B. Mayer was really worried that he was going to have to pay this guy. So I thought, keep him waiting. Why don't you send him up to Hurell's portrait gallery and let's get some photos. So they kept Jimmy Durante waiting, sent him up, and George Hurell took this photograph of him right out of the train. That's the story behind this one. Next slide. Who's this? No, actually, this is Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Okay, next slide. Joan Crawford, that's right. Next slide. Now we see Joan Crawford here, and her husband at the time, Nels Astor. Beautiful study. Next slide. Jean Harlow from Dinner at 8. Next slide. One of my favorite actresses, Myrna Loy. Beautiful study of her. These slides don't do justice. You really have to see them in person, but you get a sense. Next slide. Katharine Hepburn. Yeah. Next slide. Jean Harlow. This is a gorgeous photograph of Jean Harlow. You wonder if this is an angel trapped on earth. And Hurell observed, in talking about the stars that he photographed, he says, they just didn't walk in the door. They arrived. It was as if they had internal trumpets that just blew for them just as the door opened. And with this photograph, I think you can almost hear those trumpets blowing. All right, next slide. Greta Garbo. He only photographed her once for a 1931 film, Romance. Next slide. And here we see Clark Gable with George Hurell. And he had been at MGM for a little over a year. And by 1931, George Hurell was as famous as the stars he photographed. Like Gable, Crawford, and Harlow, he was known around the world just by his last name, Hurell. His reputation as the Rembrandt of portrait photography spread quickly throughout the industry, and within a year, practically everyone in Hollywood was seeking Hurell for his photographic portrait skills. And over the years, Hurell worked for almost all the major studios in Hollywood and photographed almost every major star. But he still had time for his friends back here in Laguna Beach. Next slide. And we see a photograph of Pancho Barnes in the back seat with Moya Stevens and Richard Halliburton at the wheel. Next slide. Another view of that trio. Next slide. And we see a photograph taken by George Hurell of Richard Halliburton and Moya Stevens just before they set out in March 1932 for their famous flying carpet journey. Next slide. And a photograph of Pancho with Moya Stevens, who she dearly loved. Well, Hurell left MGM in a dispute after a couple of years and went and took a private studio. Hurell left MGM in 1932 over a disagreement with Howard Strickling, who actually was the head of employing people at the studio. He said, "I'd gone out on a weekend to shoot Eddie Lowe and Lillian Tashman at their beach house, and when Strickling discovered that I had been shooting other outside stars, my God, you'd think I'd killed L.B. Mayer. They made such a big thing out of it, I said, go to hell." And so he just walked out the door. And Strickling basically told him the old, you'll never work in this town again. And for about 8 days, that was true. And then all of a sudden, Strickling's calling him up, and his old friend Norma Shear had to have him back. And anyway, he didn't want to go back to the studio, but he was able to make an arrangement so that all the big stars could come to him privately. And he was still a photographer for MGM, but also now set up in his own studio on Sunset Boulevard. Next slide. And here we see his business card from his first private studio, and of course his good friend Joan Crawford lent her image. This is also photographed by George Hurell. Next slide. And George Hurell relaxed his stars by playing foxtrot records and other records of the day, and he was notorious for antics. So for instance, he would jump up and down and make all kinds of noises to distract his subject, and he invented this long the shutter release was on a 40-foot cord, and it was a silent shutter. He invented the silent shutter, and so that the person never knew when their photograph was taken. Okay, next slide. And by the way, that was a George Hurell painting in the background. Sorry. You be the judge whether or not he should have stayed painting. Next. Next. All right. But he always found time to return to Laguna Beach when he could and paint. And so we see here George painting. Now, although he relocated to Hollywood to be closer to the studios, whenever he could, Hurell would break away from his duties and visit his friends here in Laguna Beach. And throughout his lifetime, Hurell returned to Laguna Beach, and as you'll see, it's always been very important to him. It was always very important to him, Laguna Beach. Next. Who's this? Actually, this is Ann Sheridan, that's right. Her career was largely initially developed through the photography by George Hurell. She was known as the Oomph Girl. Next slide. And here we see George Hurell on the set now at Columbia Studios working there. Next. Yeah. And on the set with Betty Davis. Next. And who's this? That's right, Gloria Swanson. When she came to George Hurell in the late 40s, she had already made 75 movies and was immensely wealthy, very successful film star, but no one really wanted her style of acting anymore. And came to George Hurell to help revive her career. She took some time off, but later made a pretty good film called Sunset Boulevard that most people remember her by. Next. Now, this actually, Jane Russell, right. This was, George Hurell needed a better studio, and he was making so much money that he actually had a studio built to his own specifications on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills on the site of what is now Gucci's. Guess who his landlady was? Greta Garbo. Yeah, she owned the property. Now, at the time this picture was taken, Jane Russell was an unknown starlet who was just finishing The Outlaw for Howard Hughes, another friend of Pancho Barnes. And Hurell was given a rundown on the script, which was a Western, and Hurell's creative mind decided, hey, I'll shoot her in a haystack. And there were two catchphrases used in the promotion of this film, and they used this particular still for that, and this is what they said. The first one was, how would you like to tussle with Russell? A little subtle. Then they came up with another way to promote it, and this is what they said in conjunction with this photograph. What are the two great reasons for Jane Russell's rise to stardom? That film did have some problems with the censors as a result. All right, next slide. Well, George Hurell married Phyllis Bounds, who we see there on the left, who was a Walt Disney's niece. And it was a difficult marriage, but produced 3 children, Victoria, Clancy, and Alexandra. And let's see the next slide. And here we can see some studies of Uncle Walt. Next slide. And actually, he had a production studio at Walt Disney. Okay, hold on. But he divorced, the marriage ended in divorce, and he eventually marries Betty, who was his soulmate. And that was a very, very happy marriage. It lasted till the end of his life, and that marriage produced 3 children as well. George Jr., Daphne, and Michael. And what happened is he moved to New York and started work for J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency, taking pictures for the promotion of Lux Soap, 7-Up, all these kinds of things. Because actually, after the war, the focus on glamour was over. The social agenda now was to try and assimilate the huge numbers of refugee immigrants and stir them into the melting pot of American culture. Life magazine had come out, and glamour wasn't in anymore. It now was, how much spaghetti can you get hanging out of the star's mouth? You really wanted to show that they were just like you and me, only more handsome and more beautiful. And so that's what happened. So the glamour thing was kind of over with by the 1950s, late 40s and 50s. There was little bits of it, but you couldn't get the work like before. And so George Hurell, next slide. Now on the fifth, that's J. Walter Thompson assignment. George Hurell, let's see, is right there. And he's shooting 7-Up bottles now. Next one. And we see George now using various format cameras, no longer the large format camera. Next slide. And next slide. And we see him shooting Julie Andrews here. And eventually he left New York and moves his family back here to Laguna Beach in 1959. And he moves into an apartment above a gas station that overlooks the ocean on the highway out here. And I think it's that Art Deco one from what his daughter Daphne describes. And it's interesting that when he decides to come back to Hollywood, he doesn't move to Hollywood, he moves to Laguna Beach, just 1 block from Thalia Street, where he lived initially. His roots were here. And he sort of came back here to get his spiritual center before going back up to Hollywood, I believe. So he lives here for a while and plots his return to Hollywood. And again, as you saw a moment ago, he does get back into Hollywood, and he's shooting different types of assignments, no longer very glamorous whatsoever. Now, next slide, we flash forward to about 1975, and this is a study by his friend Helmut Newton in his home. And you can see older, and on the left you'll see that these are rejected nude eggs. Rejected. And next slide. And I think Helmut Newton here was going for the fact that basically George had been forgotten. The whole scene had changed. Hollywood had changed. They really weren't into glamour as much as just quick take pictures, show relationships, and move on. But yet, like his backyard, sort of dead, so was his career. Although he was still working, but he wasn't in demand like he used to be. But he was ready for the spotlight. Next. And he wrote a book with Whitney Stein, and that book really put the focus on George Hurell. And everybody in Hollywood woke up and went, my God, this man, he created so much beauty. He really was responsible for so many people's careers and really developed the glamour idiom in photography. And there's a famous collector by the name of Bill Chapman, who had long collected his work and realized that this was a master photographer of the 20th century, and started having different shows of his work, and the stars started coming out. Next slide. And the stars started returning, and here we see Douglas Fairbanks Jr. with Loretta Young, attending one of these appreciation exhibitions. Next slide. And everybody started remembering George Hurell, and here we see him with Andy Warhol. Next slide. And even young stars were now hiring him to develop them in a glamorous way. And here we see a very early photograph of Sharon Stone. George Hurell helped her in her career get started. And of course, at one point she was the most glamorous star in the world. Okay, next. And somebody else also used him. Well, what happened to this guy? All right, next slide. And this is Fleetwood Mac. He was in demand by everybody. Everybody was using him to develop their career, and the whole glamour thing now was back in vogue in Hollywood. And next slide. And here we see a photograph of George Hurell in Paris with some Paris Vogue models. He was being sent off to take photographs just all around the world. He was in such demand. I met George Hurell in 1979, and we would meet about 4 times a year for lunch, and we'd discuss his recent work, because I was more interested in what he was doing. I was fascinated by this man who was, in his 80s and working and creating, and anyway, we'd meet. I remember him, when he showed me this photograph, he says, "Guess what, Louis?" He says, "I'm going back to Paris. If I'm there more than a week, Betty's going to kill me." But he was having the time of his life. Next slide. And here he is getting ready to shoot Paul McCartney. Next slide. And this is a study of Sherilyn Fenn from the documentary that was done by Turner Broadcast Company in 1992, produced by Greer Clark. It was called Legends in Light, and it was a documentary on the career of George Hurell. And this is one of his last portraits of a star. Next, Sherilyn Fenn. And this is George's last official portrait. Now, George Hurell passed away in 1992, and exhibitions of his work have been held at all the major museums all over the world. And as Gene noted earlier, the Laguna Beach Museum has a collection of his prints of local artists that he took when he first started his adventures in photography here in 1925-26. And a large show of his work will be on exhibition starting July 1st in the Queen Mary. I'm curating that show, and I'd love you all to come by and see the actual prints. Now, George Hurell's son, George Jr., and his wife, Jeanette, are the current custodians of the photographic legacy of George Hurell. And they have recently begun activating his archive of film negatives that were left behind in the estate, and making the lifetime work of this genius photographer and innovator once again available to us all to enjoy. Next slide. Now, as George Hurell noted in a talk here at the Laguna Beach Museum in 1978, he said, "I look back on my early years in Laguna Beach with great fondness, and I'm thankful to the wonderful artists living here who instilled in me a sense of joy in creating, in dreaming, and in achieving, as they created and dreamed and achieved." When George Hurell passed away in 1992, he left behind not only a valuable record of an era, but the ever-enticing illusion of human perfectibility. And in doing so, I think he helped us all to feel better, to dream better, and to imagine more for ourselves and for everyone else. And so I say thank you to George Hurell for his contributions and for the inspiration. And both Pancho passed away in 1975, and as I said, George in 1992. And they were good people, and I'm sure they went on to their just rewards. And if they did, they're probably fishing right now somewhere. And knowing Pancho, though, I bet you anything that George is still having to cook those fish. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. And I wanted to thank you all for coming.
Hey, come on, let's hear it for Lou DeLeo.